Sarah Martinez walked through the crowded coffee shop, her worn leather jacket drawing snickers and whispers from the other customers. The jacket had seen better days. Its brown leather was cracked at the elbows, the zipper stuck halfway up, and several patches covered holes that had formed over the years. But Sarah wore it with quiet dignity, just as she had every day for the past 15 years. She approached the counter, fishing through her pockets for enough change to buy a small coffee. The barista, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and designer clothes, looked at Sarah with barely concealed disgust. Behind her in line, a group of college students pointed and giggled. "Look at that old jacket," one of them whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It looks like it belongs in a dumpster. Someone should tell her that Goodwill has better clothes than that," another added, causing the group to burst into laughter. Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept her eyes forward. She had heard comments like these before. As a janitor at the local community center, she wasn't exactly rolling in money. This jacket was all she could afford, and despite its appearance, it meant everything to her. The barista rolled her eyes as Sarah counted out coins on the counter. "Just a small black coffee, please," Sarah said softly. "That'll be $2.50, the barista replied curtly, making no effort to hide her impatience as Sarah continued searching for the right change. More laughter erupted from behind her. A businessman in an expensive suit shook his head and muttered, "Some people have no self-respect." Sarah finally gathered enough coins and placed them on the counter. As she waited for her coffee, she noticed a young mother covering her child's eyes and pulling him away from her. The woman whispered something about not staring at homeless people, even though Sarah had a job and a small apartment across town. The coffee shop was filled with the morning rush crowd. Lawyers, doctors, business owners, and college students all seemed to blend together in their judgment of her appearance. Sarah had learned to tune out most of the comments over the years, but today they seemed particularly cruel. She received her coffee and found a small table in the corner, hoping to drink it in peace before heading to work, but the whispers and stares continued. A group of office workers at the next table made no attempt to lower their voices as they discussed her fashion choices. "I don't understand how someone can let themselves go like that," one woman said, adjusting her expensive pearl necklace. "It's really quite sad." "Maybe she's mentally ill," her companion suggested. "Normal people don't dress like that." Sarah gripped her coffee cup tighter, fighting back tears. She wanted to tell them about her life, about why this jacket was so important to her, but she knew they wouldn't listen. People like this had already made up their minds about her based on appearance alone. As she sat there, Sarah remembered how different things used to be. 20 years ago, she had been a respected sergeant in the Army, serving her country with pride. She had worn uniforms that commanded respect, carried herself with military bearing, and led soldiers who looked up to her. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. The jacket she wore now wasn't just any old piece of clothing. Hidden beneath one of the patches on the left sleeve was something that told a story these strangers would never guess. It was a story of service, sacrifice, and honor that had shaped who she was, even if the world couldn't see it anymore. Her military service had ended abruptly when she was injured during a training exercise. A piece of shrapnel from an explosive device had damaged her spine, leaving her with chronic pain and limited mobility. The injury had cost her not only her military career but also her confidence and sense of purpose. After her discharge, Sarah had struggled to find her place in civilian life. The transition from military service to ordinary jobs had been harder than she ever imagined. Employers seemed to overlook her military experience, focusing instead on her lack of traditional civilian work history. The few jobs she could find were low-paying positions that barely covered her basic needs. The community center where she worked now was run by a kind man named Mr. Peterson, who had served in Vietnam. He understood what veterans went through and had given Sarah a chance when no one else would. The pay wasn't much, but it was honest work. and she took pride in keeping the building clean and welcoming for the children and families who used it. As Sarah continued to endure the stares and comments in the coffee shop, she thought about the irony of her situation. These people who looked down on her had no idea that she had once risked her life to protect their freedom. They saw only a poor woman in old clothes, not a veteran who had served with distinction. The worst part wasn't the financial struggle or even the daily humiliation. It was the loneliness. Sarah had lost touch with most of her military friends over the years. Some had moved on to successful careers, others had struggled with their own demons after service. She had tried joining veteran support groups, but they met during her work hours, and she couldn't afford to miss any shifts. Her small apartment was barely furnished, with just the essentials she needed to get by. She had sold most of her military memorabilia years ago to pay rent and medical bills. The only things she kept were a few photographs and the small patch hidden under the repair work on her jacket sleeve. That patch represented the proudest moment of her military career. She had received it after a mission where her quick thinking and bravery had saved several lives. Her commanding officer had called her a hero, and for a brief moment Sarah had felt like she truly mattered in the world. Now, sitting in this coffee shop surrounded by people who treated her like she was invisible or worse, Sarah wondered if that moment of heroism had been worth it. Had she really made a difference, or had it all been for nothing? The morning sun streamed through the coffee shop windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Sarah watched them float aimlessly, feeling a kinship with their directionless movement. She had been drifting through life for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have a clear purpose. But despite everything she had been through, Sarah still carried herself with a quiet dignity that came from her military training. She kept her back straight, her shoulders squared, and her head held high, even when the world seemed determined to tear her down. Some habits, once learned in the service, never truly disappeared. As she finished her coffee and prepared to leave for work, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was older, more tired, and certainly more weathered than the young soldier she had once been. But in her eyes there was still a spark of the person she used to be, buried beneath years of struggle and disappointment. Sarah stood up slowly, her back aching from the old injury. She pulled her worn jacket tighter around her shoulders and walked toward the door, ignoring the final round of snickers and comments from the other customers. She had work to do, and despite what these people thought of her, she took pride in doing it well. Little did Sarah know that her life was about to change in a way she never could have imagined. Sometimes the universe has a way of reminding people that appearances can be deceiving and that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places. Sarah arrived at the community center just as she did every morning at 7:30. The building was old but well-maintained, serving as a hub for after-school programs, senior activities, and community meetings. She unlocked the front door with her set of keys and began her daily routine of cleaning and preparing the space for the day's activities. Mr. Peterson was already in his office, reviewing paperwork for the upcoming fundraising event. The center was struggling financially, and they needed to raise money to keep the programs running. Sarah knocked gently on his doorframe. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," she said with a small smile. "Good morning, Sarah. How are you feeling today?" He always asked about her health, knowing about her old military injury. "Can't complain. What's on the schedule today?" "We have the usual after-school programs, and there's a special presentation this afternoon. Some military officials are coming to speak to the kids about service and citizenship. Should be interesting." Sarah nodded and went about her work. She had mixed feelings about military presentations. On one hand, she was proud of her service and believed in the values they would teach. On the other hand, these events reminded her of everything she had lost and could no longer be. As the morning progressed, children began arriving for the various programs. Sarah loved seeing their bright faces and hearing their laughter echo through the halls. These kids came from all different backgrounds, many from families that struggled financially just like she did. But here at the center, they were all treated equally and given opportunities to learn and grow. Around noon, Sarah was mopping the main hall when she heard vehicles pulling up outside. Through the large windows, she could see several official-looking cars and a small bus. Military personnel in dress uniforms began stepping out, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. It had been years since she had seen active-duty service members in their formal attire. She quickly moved to the supply closet, not wanting to be in the way during their setup. From there, she could hear the commanding voices of officers directing the preparation for their presentation. The sound brought back a flood of memories from her own time in service. Mr. Peterson appeared in the hallway, looking slightly nervous about hosting such important guests. "Sarah, could you make sure the main hall is spotless? These are some high-ranking officials, and I want everything to be perfect." "Of course, Mr. Peterson. I'll take care of it." Sarah emerged from the supply closet and began giving the main hall one final cleaning. As she worked, she noticed one particular officer who seemed to be in charge of the group. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and numerous ribbons and medals on his uniform. Even from a distance, she could tell he was someone important by the way others deferred to him. The officer was directing the setup when his gaze happened to fall on Sarah. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Sarah quickly looked away and continued her work, but she felt his attention lingering on her. She wondered if he was annoyed by her presence during their preparation. As the afternoon approached, families and children began filling the hall for the presentation. Sarah finished her work and was preparing to leave when Mr. Peterson approached her again. "Sarah, would you mind staying to help serve refreshments afterward? I know it's not part of your regular duties, but we could use the extra help." Sarah hesitated. Being around so many military personnel made her uncomfortable, but she didn't want to let Mr. Peterson down. "Sure, I can stay." The presentation began with the high-ranking officer Sarah had noticed earlier introducing himself as General Morrison. His voice was strong and clear as he spoke to the gathered crowd about the importance of service to country and community. He talked about the values of honor, courage, and commitment that defined military service. As he spoke, Sarah found herself drawn into his words, despite her intention to stay in the background. General Morrison had a way of speaking that made military service sound noble and meaningful again, reminding her of why she had enlisted in the first place. "Service isn't just about wearing a uniform," the general was saying. "It's about putting others before yourself, even when no one is watching. It's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult. And it's about carrying those values with you long after your official service has ended." The children listened with wide eyes as the general and his team showed them military equipment and talked about different career opportunities. Sarah watched from the back of the room, remembering when she had been the one inspiring others to serve their country. During the presentation, Sarah noticed that General Morrison's eyes occasionally drifted in her direction. She assumed he was simply scanning the room as experienced speakers often did, but something about his attention made her nervous. When the formal presentation ended, the refreshment period began. Sarah busied herself serving juice and cookies to the children and their families. She tried to stay inconspicuous, but the small space meant she occasionally had to navigate around the military personnel. As she was refilling the juice pitchers, Sarah didn't notice General Morrison approaching until he was standing directly behind her. She turned around and nearly dropped the pitcher, startled to find herself face-to-face with the high-ranking officer. "Excuse me, miss," General Morrison said politely. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm General Morrison." "I'm Sarah Martinez," she replied quietly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I work here at the center. It's a pleasure to meet you, Sarah. You've done excellent work preparing for our visit today. The facility is immaculate." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. She wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially from someone of such obvious importance. "Thank you, General. I just try to keep things clean and welcoming for the children." As they spoke, General Morrison's eyes kept drifting to Sarah's jacket, which she had hung over a nearby chair while she worked. His expression seemed puzzled, as if something about it troubled him, but he was too polite to stare directly at it. "Have you lived in this area long?" the general asked, making conversation. "About 10 years now. I moved here after—" Sarah paused, unsure how much to reveal. "After I left my previous job." "I see. And what kind of work did you do before?" Sarah hesitated again. She rarely talked about her military service with strangers, partly because it felt like a lifetime ago and partly because people's reactions were unpredictable. Some thanked her for her service, others seemed skeptical that someone in her position could have served, and still others simply didn't know what to say. "I was in the Army," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. General Morrison's eyebrows raised slightly. "Is that so? What was your MOS?" He used the military term for job specialty, which told Sarah he was genuinely interested rather than just being polite. "I was a 31B, military police." "Military police," the general repeated, nodding approvingly. "That's important work. What years did you serve?" 15 years. I enlisted right out of high school and stayed until—" Sarah's voice trailed off as she thought about her injury and medical discharge. General Morrison seemed to sense there was more to the story, but he didn't push. Instead, he thanked her again for her service and excused himself to speak with other attendees. But Sarah noticed that his attention kept returning to her throughout the rest of the event. As the afternoon wound down and the military personnel prepared to leave, Sarah went to retrieve her jacket from the chair where she had left it. She was putting it on when she felt someone approaching behind her again. "Sarah," came General Morrison's voice. She turned to face him, and this time his expression was more serious than it had been during their earlier conversation. "I couldn't help but notice your jacket," he said carefully. "It's quite distinctive." Sarah looked down at the worn leather, suddenly feeling self-conscious about its shabby appearance. "I know it's not much to look at, but it's warm and durable." No, General Morrison said quickly. "That's not what I meant. There's something about one of those patches." He gestured toward her left sleeve, where several fabric patches covered holes and tears in the leather. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to cover the area he was indicating. Beneath one of those patches was something she had kept hidden for years, something that connected her to a part of her military service she rarely discussed with anyone. General Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Sarah, would you mind if I took a closer look at that patch? I think I might recognize it." Sarah's heart began racing. Very few people would recognize the significance of what was hidden under that ordinary-looking patch. For someone to spot it, they would have had to serve in very specific circumstances or hold a very high security clearance. She looked around the room, noting that most people had already left, and those who remained were busy with cleanup. Mr. Peterson was in his office, and the other military personnel were loading their equipment outside. "I'm not sure what you mean, General," Sarah said nervously. But General Morrison's eyes had taken on a look of recognition mixed with something that might have been shock. His gaze was fixed on her sleeve with an intensity that made Sarah's pulse quicken. "Sarah," he said slowly, his voice filled with a gravity that hadn't been there before. "I need to ask you something very important. That patch you're hiding under there, does it have anything to do with Operation Desert Shield?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Operation Desert Shield was classified information that very few people outside of those directly involved would know about. It had been a covert mission that took place during her service, one that she was still not supposed to discuss with unauthorized personnel. Sarah's face went pale, and her hand tightened protectively over her sleeve. "General, I'm not sure what you're talking about." But even as she said it, Sarah knew that General Morrison had somehow recognized what she had been trying to keep hidden for all these years. The question was how, and more importantly, what he intended to do about it. The room seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what would happen next. General Morrison's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching reverence as he studied Sarah's face. The recognition in his eyes was unmistakable now, and Sarah felt the carefully constructed walls she had built around her past beginning to crumble. "Sergeant Martinez," the general said quietly, using her former rank, "you saved my life." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 20 years of separation. Sarah's legs suddenly felt weak, and she gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. She had never expected this moment to come, never thought anyone from that mission would remember her or seek her out. "General Morrison," she whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. "You were Lieutenant Morrison then." "The convoy ambush." "That's right." His voice was thick with emotion. "You and your MP unit were supposed to be escorting our supply convoy through what intel said was a secure route, but someone had leaked our position to insurgents." The memories came flooding back to Sarah with painful clarity. It had been a routine escort mission that turned deadly within minutes. Their convoy of 6 vehicles had been traveling through a narrow mountain pass when the attack began from multiple directions. Explosions, gunfire, screams, and chaos had erupted all around them. "I remember," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Our lead vehicle hit an IED. 3 of our guys were hurt bad. Then the small arms fire started from the ridges." General Morrison nodded grimly. "My vehicle was the 3rd in line. We took an RPG hit to the engine block. I was trapped inside with a broken leg and probable concussion. The fuel tank was leaking, and we knew it was going to blow." "You kept trying to get your radio operator out," Sarah continued, the scene playing out in her mind like it had happened yesterday. "But he was unconscious, and you couldn't move him with your injured leg." "That's when you appeared through the smoke like some kind of angel," the general said with deep respect in his voice. "Enemy fire was coming from 3 directions, and you ran straight through it to reach our vehicle." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the terror and determination she had felt in that moment. Her training had taken over, pushing aside fear and focusing solely on the mission of protecting the lives under her charge. "I had to make a choice," she said quietly. "Leave you both and take cover, or risk everything to get you out before the fuel ignited." "You chose to risk everything," General Morrison said firmly. "You dragged my radio operator to safety first, even though I outranked him. Then you came back for me, even though the vehicle was already smoking and making those sounds that meant it was about to explode." "It was my job," Sarah said simply, though they both knew it had been far more than that. Many soldiers might have made the calculation that saving 2 lives wasn't worth risking a 3rd, especially when enemy fire was so intense. Your job was to escort our convoy safely. Going back into a vehicle that was about to explode while under heavy fire was heroic, not just dutiful. The general's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You pulled me out with 30 seconds to spare before the whole thing went up in flames." Sarah remembered the explosion that had lifted her off her feet and sent debris raining down around them. The heat had been so intense that it had singed her eyebrows and left her ears ringing for hours afterward. "What I remember most," General Morrison continued, "was what you said when I tried to thank you afterward. You told me that every soldier matters, regardless of rank, and that leaving people behind wasn't an option." "I meant it," Sarah said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he had recognized her. "I know you did. That's what made it so powerful." The general reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "Sarah, do you have any idea what happened after that mission? I know it was classified." I was told never to discuss it with anyone without proper clearance. Sarah had followed those orders faithfully for 20 years, even when keeping the secret felt like it was slowly eating away at her identity. The intelligence you gathered during that firefight led to the capture of the largest weapons cache in the region, General Morrison explained. While you were saving lives under fire, you also managed to identify the enemy positions and relay coordinates that allowed our air support to neutralize the threat. Sarah shook her head slightly. I was just doing what needed to be done. The radio operator you saved first? Staff Sergeant Williams? General Morrison's voice grew even more serious. He went on to become one of our most decorated intelligence specialists. The information he gathered over the next 10 years of his career prevented countless attacks and saved hundreds of lives. None of that would have happened if you hadn't risked everything to pull him from that burning vehicle. The weight of these revelations was almost too much for Sarah to process. She had spent so many years thinking of herself as a failure, as someone who had washed out of the military and never made a real difference in the world. Sarah, General Morrison said gently, what happened to you after that mission? Your record shows you continued serving with distinction for several more years. I was injured during a training exercise about 5 years later, Sarah explained. Shrapnel damage to my spine. The doctor said I could stay in the service with a desk job, but I wasn't the same soldier I had been. I took a medical discharge and tried to start over in civilian life. And how has that transition been for you? Sarah looked down at her worn jacket, thinking about the morning's humiliation in the coffee shop and the countless other indignities she had endured over the years. It's been difficult, General. Very difficult. General Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an expression of deep concern. Sarah, I've been looking for you for 15 years. Looking for me? Why? Because I owed you a debt that I could never repay. But more than that, because what you did that day exemplified everything that's best about military service. I've told your story countless times to young officers as an example of what real courage looks like. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. For so long, she had felt forgotten and invisible, convinced that her service had meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. Every year on the anniversary of that mission, I've submitted recommendations for you to receive proper recognition, the general continued. But your file was classified so heavily that the decorations board couldn't access the details they needed to approve the awards. General, I never expected any recognition. I was just doing your job, I know. But Sarah, heroism that goes unrecognized doesn't become less heroic. It just means the system failed to honor someone who deserved better. General Morrison looked around the community center, taking in the children's artwork on the walls and the obvious care that went into maintaining the facility. Tell me about your work here, he said. I'm the janitor, Sarah replied, bracing herself for the look of pity she often saw when people learned about her current circumstances. But General Morrison's expression didn't change to pity. Instead, he nodded approvingly. You're serving your community. Different uniform, same heart. It's not exactly saving lives under fire, Sarah said with a bitter laugh. Isn't it? The general asked seriously. This place provides a safe haven for children who might otherwise be on the streets. You maintain this environment that allows kids to learn and grow and stay out of trouble. That absolutely saves lives, Sarah. It just does it one day at a time, instead of one dramatic moment. Sarah had never thought of her work that way before. She had always seen it as just a job she was lucky to have, not as a continuation of her service to others. Sarah, I need to ask you something, General Morrison said, his tone becoming more official. That patch under your repair work, it's your unit commendation from Operation Desert Shield, isn't it? Sarah nodded slowly, her hand moving instinctively to cover the hidden patch again. You've carried it with you all these years, even though you couldn't tell anyone what it meant? It was the only thing I had left that proved I had mattered once, Sarah said quietly. When everything else fell apart, when I couldn't serve anymore, when people started looking at me like I was nothing. That patch reminded me that I had been a good soldier once. General Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with determination. Sarah, I want you to come to the Pentagon next month. There's going to be a ceremony, and you're going to receive the recognition you should have gotten 20 years ago. The Silver Star at minimum, and probably several other decorations that have been waiting for proper declassification. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. General, I appreciate the thought, but I'm nobody special now. I'm just a janitor in an old jacket. You're Sergeant Sarah Martinez, who risked her life to save others and exemplified the finest traditions of military service. That doesn't change because your circumstances changed. A hero doesn't stop being a hero because the world fails to recognize them. But, General, I can't afford to travel to Washington. I can barely afford to keep this old jacket repaired. General Morrison smiled, and for the first time since recognizing her, he looked like the confident military leader she remembered from their brief encounter 20 years ago. Sarah, the travel will be taken care of. So will new dress blues for the ceremony. And there's something else. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I've been authorized to offer you a position in the Veterans Affairs Department. It's a civilian role, but it involves working with other veterans who are struggling with their transition to civilian life. Your experience, both military and personal, would be invaluable. Sarah felt dizzy with the magnitude of what was happening. In the space of 30 minutes, her entire world had shifted from invisible struggle to unexpected recognition and opportunity. I don't understand, she said weakly. Why would you do all this? Because 20 years ago, you proved that one person's courage can change everything. Today, I have the power to change everything for you. It's not charity, Sarah. It's justice that's long overdue. As if on cue, Mr. Peterson appeared from his office, having finished his paperwork. He took in the scene of Sarah in intense conversation with the general and approached cautiously. Is everything all right here? He asked. General Morrison turned to him with a broad smile. Mr. Peterson, do you realize that you have a genuine American hero working in your facility? Mr. Peterson looked confused, glancing between Sarah and the general. I know Sarah is a veteran, and she's been an exemplary employee, but... This woman, General Morrison said, placing a respectful hand on Sarah's shoulder, saved my life and the lives of others under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. She's one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to serve alongside. Mr. Peterson's eyes widened as he looked at Sarah with new understanding. Sarah, why didn't you ever tell me? It was classified, Sarah said simply, and honestly, it felt like a different lifetime. I didn't think anyone would remember or care. Well, I remember, General Morrison said firmly, and I care. And in about 6 weeks, the entire military community is going to remember and care too. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. For so long, she had felt like a ghost of her former self, invisible to a world that had no place for broken-down veterans. But standing here in this community center, surrounded by the echoes of children's laughter and facing a man who had never forgotten her sacrifice, she began to remember who she really was. The worn jacket that had brought her so much shame that morning suddenly felt different on her shoulders. It wasn't just a symbol of her current struggles anymore. It was proof that she had survived, that she had carried her values and her hidden honor through the darkest times, waiting for a moment just like this one. Tomorrow, Sarah Martinez would walk through that same coffee shop, and people might still see a woman in an old jacket. But now she would know something they couldn't see. She was a hero who had never stopped serving, even when the world had forgotten to salute.